Hi guys, so I was hoping to kick off this review by holding up my copy of the original Resident Evil from 1996 and saying, it's time to go back to where it all started, but I guess at some point I must have gotten rid of my copy of the original Resident Evil because I couldn't find it this morning. All I could find was this. So I guess instead I'm just going to say, it's time to go back to the two games which came out just before this one. Welcome to my review for the new Resident Evil film, which I saw just over a week ago now, so I've sort of dragged my heels a little bit in terms of doing my review. But you know what, the UK got this film 10 days after the USA, so I was never going to win a foot race in terms of getting my opinions out there onto YouTube. This was one of my most anticipated films of the year, and it'll probably also be my final film of the year in terms of going to the cinema due to this new COVID variant. I'm not planning to go back now until probably Scream at the end of January, touch wood. Now, despite my enthusiasm for this Resi reboot, I did have some mixed feelings coming into it. On the positive side, this promised to be a much more faithful adaptation of the old video games, which was great for me because I'm a big fan of the video game side of Resident Evil. I played at least half of the games, including all the old ones on which this particular film is based. I was also pleased with the choice of director. Johannes Roberts did the excellent 47 Meters Down and its sequel, two films that I really like. I've got them on my shelf, no worries there. But on the downside, I heard a few months ago that this film was going to be adapting not just the first Resi game, but also the second game. And I thought to myself, how will they properly do that in a 90-minute movie? Surely there's too much material to get through. And I have to say, having seen the movie, even though I enjoyed it, they have skimped on so much good stuff. Mainly in terms of the monsters and the various creatures that used to spook me when I was playing the old games. I mean, there's no Mr. X from Resi 2. There's no giant spiders. There's no giant snake. There's none of those zombies with their skin missing from down in the labs beneath the mansion. You don't even get to see anybody using a hexagonal crank to unblock a dam. Well, maybe I'm not too bothered about that last one, actually. It's all left me wondering why they took this approach, and the only thing I can think of is that with 15 or 16 games out there, they probably wanted to give themselves the best chance of getting through all those games while they've got this set of actors, because realistically, you're never going to do more than 4, 5, 6 films in a series before it comes to an end. But it's all left me thinking that maybe the best way to do all the Resident Evil games is to just do one long running TV series, because this approach wasn't entirely ideal for me. I did enjoy it, but it was also extremely frustrating as to all the stuff that got left out. I don't want to sound like a spoiled fanboy. I still enjoyed the movie, and we're going to get into some of those positives in just a moment. So if you don't know, this is a film about a fictional place called Raccoon City, where a rogue corporation called Umbrella started to make all the local townsfolk turn into zombies. The police get involved and they find Umbrella's secret lab just outside of the city limits, where it turns out they've been dabbling in viral weaponry and other nefarious practices. That's probably the worst description of Resident Evil ever, but this is not an easy franchise to sum up briefly. It's got a very complicated mythology when you get into it. To my surprise, this is quite an action-heavy interpretation of Resident Evil. I thought, coming so soon on the heels of the Jovovich ones, they would go for a more pure horror approach this time, but pound for pound, I'd say there's more action in this version of Resident Evil than there was in the equivalent film which kicked off Mila Jovovich's run. There are quite a few scenes throughout this one, though, that you definitely wouldn't have got on Paul Anderson's watch. For example, there's one moment where I think Chris Redfield it is, who is in the mansion and he's fighting off a zombie horde, but he's doing it in the dark and it's really tense. If this had been Mila Jovovich, everywhere would have been lit. She would have been doing backflips. So there is sort of a change of style with this reboot, but still way more action than I would have thought, which was a surprise to me. In terms of the actors, I didn't really recognise anybody coming into this apart from the guy who plays the police chief, Donal Locke, I think his name is. He was in the Gotham TV show. But I realised after watching Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City that Kaya Scodelario, she's got a tricky name, she plays Claire Redfield. Turns out I've seen her before. She was in Crawl and the fifth Pirates of the Caribbean films. I'm going to try not to forget her again because she's an excellent actress. And she's been in 3 films now that I've really enjoyed. I'd also say that she is the standout in this film. She plays the Claire Redfield character. It helps, I guess, that Claire is the only character in this who gets any kind of depth or a backstory. I think if this series goes on for quite a few films, then the other characters who have survived this film will eventually get films which focus more on them. But for now, Claire is definitely in the driving seat, which is fine by me because I think Claire Redfield has always been one of my favourite Resident Evil characters, her and Rebecca Chambers. The film does a thing which I really appreciated. So all the way through this, Claire and Jill Valentine are never on screen together. And I thought to myself, okay, well, in the finale, their storylines are bound to intersect late on, which they do. But I thought that when that happened, there would be this horribly cheesy moment where they would size each other up and come out with a few lines that are just designed to let the other know that they're the toughest chick in the room. But thankfully, the movie skipped past that, if it ever happened, because one minute Claire and Jill are just not in the same place in this, and then the next minute they're running down a corridor together. So I was grateful for the film for that. I would say that this version of Claire Redfield is better than the one from the Jovovich films. I wasn't massively keen on the Ali Larter version, but I would say that the Jill Valentine from the Jovovich films is better than this one. It's not that I'm bothered that this Jill doesn't have the right look for the character. It's just that she doesn't get the same backstory or attention to detail that Claire Redfield does, but this is something which could be amended in later films if we get that far. I know the box office for this particular Resident Evil film has not been that great. This really could be just a one-off nostalgia trip, really, for Resident Evil fans who have always wanted to see a somewhat faithful adaptation of the games. The soundtrack is definitely one of the film's strong suits. This film is set in 1998, so there are lots of songs that crop up which would have been released from that particular time period. As somebody who literally started going clubbing in 1998, I'm quite emotionally sensitive to music that would have been released in that era. So for me, the songs in this film definitely hit the sweet spot, but the rest of the soundtrack, the rest of the score is very effective as well. There are lots of gothic bits and pieces that play in the background of certain scenes that sort of reminded me a little bit of The Omen. I would say that this is the second best soundtrack in this entire franchise after the amazing Resident Evil Afterlife. For my final positive, albeit with a few caveats bolted on, I'm going to talk a little bit about the finale on the underground train. I have always wanted to see Resident Evil characters take on one of those final bosses on the big screen that have like the eyeballs all over them, and with every eyeball that gets taken out, the creature in question gets a little bit weaker. We get that here, and I got a big kick out of seeing it, though I will say that the creature doesn't quite feel squelchy enough in this. It doesn't feel Evil Dead-ish. If you think of the ending to Tremors when they blow up the second last worm, all those pieces come out of the sky and you get innards landing on the characters and it's all gooey, and you get a great sense as to the physicality of the creature that they've just destroyed. You don't really get that with this. CGI is sadly very, very noticeable throughout this movie, and especially at the end. When the rocket launcher takes out the Birkin thing, you hardly get to see the result of that chaos. I will defend the movie on a couple of things I've seen in a couple of reviews, though. Firstly, this idea that the characters couldn't fire that rocket launcher in such a confined space without killing themselves or deafening themselves. There's also a bit earlier on where a helicopter crashes through one of the walls of the mansion and nobody hears it from about 3 rooms away. There's always been this kind of cheesy, unrealistic angle to Resident Evil, which if you don't play the games, you might not truly get. It's right there from the very first game that came out on the PS1, you know, Jill Valentine running around with a lockpick, when in real life all she'd have to do is just kick the doors in. Resident Evil as a franchise is not ultra emo serious like something like Silent Hill. There's always been that cheesy, playful thing about it. So personally, yes, I did notice the rocket launcher thing. I thought to myself that might not play well with some people, but it's part of the Resident Evil DNA. So I'm not going to criticise this film for one or two little things which couldn't possibly happen in the real world. That being said, I can't defend everything, and I've got a few more negatives to quickly whip through before we get to the end of this, as much as it's going to pain me. So, firstly, I go back again to this idea of trying to knock off two games in the same film. What this results in, beyond what I've already talked about, is that we spend a lot of time with one group of characters as they explore the mansion in the woods, and we spend a lot of time with another group of characters who are having their own little subplot in a police station. There's lots of back and forth and jumping between the two groups, and it gets a little bit jarring. Just as I'm starting to enjoy one path, I'm then transported to the other one. In the days since I've watched this movie, I've found it very difficult to look back on and process the story, because in my head now it's just a jumble of scenes and situations and characters and deaths, and I can't remember which bit was on one subplot, which bit was in another location. This is something which could be helped by more than one watch of the film, but it's not ideal. I really don't like the approach that they went with this. I would rather have just followed one story set in one of these locations. Next thing to moan about a little bit, I guess, is the opening in the orphanage. Now, I get that this gives Claire a bit of backstory, whereas most of the other characters don't have an awful lot in that department, but it's a very slow start to the film. I was getting a little bit kind of frustrated that the film doesn't really come out and grab you. You really have to wait a little while for it to get going. And if we flip to the very end of the movie with the post-credit sequence as well, I found that a little bit off. I mean, this film is not likely to have a sequel, I don't think. I'm fine with it being its own one-off thing. I could still enjoy it in the future that way. But if that's the case, then when those characters come out of the train tunnel, I want that to be it. I want that to be the ending. I don't want to see this little scene with Ada and Wesker teasing a future that isn't going to happen. So a bit of overconfidence there, I think, on the part of the director and the studio. That's all I've got, though. For the most part, this is an enjoyable ride. It got my adrenaline going. It does have its problems. Artistically, there are things that I certainly would have done a lot differently. But let's get to the bag of terror and see how it all translates into a score. So we've got 1, 2, 3 bloody axes out of 5. I think that accurately represents how I feel about this movie. It's pretty good. It's not the worst Resident Evil film I've ever seen, but it's certainly not the best. There are some in the Jovovich run of films which I would class as being better than this, but I'm certainly interested to see how I feel about it after I've watched it again on Blu-ray. But for now, this is what I'm giving it. And I will be back soon to review the Resident Evil animated films. That's what I'm going to be moving on to. We're not getting to the ranking just yet. I think there's 3 animated films to go, and then I will probably do the ranking. Right, until next time, cheerio, bye-bye.